Hi, this is Simon Jarrett for Kingsley Amplifiers. I thought I'd make a video to talk a little bit about the deal behind guitar preamplifier pedals. We offer a range of preamplifiers in pedal format, and in our case they're valve preamps or tube preamps. Now, preamps are found in a lot of different audio gear. They're in tape delays, they're in recording consoles, they're in effects pedals, they're in all sorts of things. But what I'm referring to is preamplifiers which you would find within a guitar amplifier. These preamps that we make are designed to be able to replace a traditional guitar preamp that you'd find as part of an amplifier. Let's take a look at a preamplifier's function. Now, if you take a traditional guitar amp, it contains within it a preamplifier and a power amplifier. Then you've got the speakers, which could be housed in the same enclosure or in a separate enclosure. So the preamp's fundamental job is to take the input signal, which comes from your guitar, and to raise that input signal to a higher level so that the power amplifier can make use of that signal to drive the loudspeakers efficiently. The voltage signal, which comes out of your guitar, is quite small, and the input into the power amplifier wants to see a larger voltage. So the preamplifier's job is basically to take the input voltage and amplify it to a higher voltage. So a preamplifier is basically a voltage amplifier. Now, traditionally in a guitar amp, we find tone controls in the preamp as well, of some type. So you might have a tone knob, or you might have separate treble and bass, or perhaps treble, middle and bass. And then of course you've got a volume control, and sometimes other features like maybe a bright switch, maybe a gain pot for setting overdrive. So there are various features you'll find which are part of the preamplifier. The preamplifier affects the sound quite a lot, obviously because the tone controls are there, so you can change the sound a lot. And traditionally, over the years, I think guitar preamplifiers have started to sound a certain way. Typically they tend to scoop the mids and they tend to boost the treble and bass quite a bit. So a preamplifier sound for electric guitar is not really a flat frequency response sound. Now, if you take a guitar and you plug straight into a power amp directly, you'll find the sound to be a little bit flat, which equates to us as like dull and lifeless, without any presence. So the preamplifier takes care of that and adds some of the presence, tends to scoop the mids, and colours the sound quite a lot. So here are some applications for preamplifiers, and in our case preamplifier pedals. In the 80s and the 90s, quite a lot of guitar players started using rack mount systems with separate preamps and separate power amps. So you can use our preamplifier pedals in just the same way to drive a power amplifier directly. It could be a solid state power amplifier like the Seymour Duncan Power Stage, for example, or a tube power amplifier like that found within the Fryette Power Station, and many others that are available. So this allows you to build a custom rig where you choose each component to build a certain sound. So basically it gives you flexibility. Now, if you have a traditional guitar amp with a preamp and a power amp in it, of course, what you can also do is you can use a separate preamp to replace your amp's built-in preamp. Now, in order to do this, your amp needs to have some way of accessing the power amp directly. On some amps there's a dedicated power amp in jack. On other amps they don't have that, but quite a lot of amps these days have effects loops, and the effects return is effectively a path into your amp's power amp. So you can take the output of a preamplifier and you can plug it into the effects return, thus bypassing your amp's built-in preamplifier. And this will open up new sound possibilities. Even if it's a clean preamp replacing another clean preamp, you'll find that it'll affect the sound of the amp quite a lot and could very much change what your pedals do and how they sound. The most common effects pedal is probably the overdrive or distortion pedal, and the sound that they produce varies a lot depending on what amplifier you plug into. So if you can change the preamp, you can fine-tune things a lot and make different overdrive or distortion pedals take on quite a different character. Now, what if your amplifier doesn't have a power amp in or an effects loop? So in that case, well, then you can plug the preamplifier directly into the front end of your amp. The only thing here is you've got to be aware that your preamp inside your amp is colouring the sound quite a lot, and the preamp you choose is probably going to colour the sound quite a lot as well. So if you've got two preamps that scoop the mids quite a bit, you might find it to be excessively mid-scooped. It could be boomy on the low end, you could have too much treble, so it could sound kind of harsh, especially with overdrive pedals. So what you need to do is flatten out the frequency response of either your amp's preamp or the external preamp you choose. If you set the amp's controls a little flatter, usually that entails turning off any bright switch, perhaps rolling back the treble a little bit, perhaps raising the mids, sometimes lowering the bass. You're just trying to get a more flat, neutral sound, and that enables the preamplifier to do what it's designed to do best. Now, of course, there'll be times where you don't want to do this because perhaps you've got an amp and you really like its fundamental sound and you don't want to mess with where you set the dials. So in that case, of course, you'll have to choose a preamp that has decent tone controls and some range in the tone controls so that you can darken up the preamp or flatten its frequency response out enough that it sounds good into your amp. If you're a guitar player who does gigs where backline equipment is supplied, then you're at the mercy of whatever the amps are that are provided for the gig. So having your own preamplifier in this case can be quite nice because you can rely on the preamplifier that you've chosen and you know it works well with your pedals. Now, depending on the amp that's been provided, you can either plug into the power amp if the amp has a power amp in or an effects loop return, or if it doesn't, you can plug into the front end, in which case I suggest setting the controls on the amp flatter so that your preamp can work the way you expect it to. So that's a nice application for a separate preamplifier. Another scenario might be, let's say you've got an amplifier with a built-in preamp that you really like and you don't want to mess with the tone controls, you want to leave it like that, but you'd still like to get access to a different preamp, but you'd like it to replace your amp's preamp and to be able to sort of easily switch between the two on the fly. And there's a way to do that too. If you put the preamplifier pedal in a dedicated audio loop and then you put your amp's preamp in a separate dedicated audio loop, then you can switch between them. So these days, quite a lot of guitar players are starting to use true bypass effects loop switches, where different pedals go in individual loops and you can switch between them. It cleans up your signal path, and quite often it gives you other advantages like the ability to choose preset combinations of pedals. Now, of course, you can put a separate preamp in one of these loops quite easily. Now, as far as the preamp in your amp, you can think of the input jack on your amp as the preamp in, and you can think of the preamp out, or the effects send, as the output of the preamplifier. So then you've got the in and the out for your amp's preamp, and then you can put that in a separate audio loop, and now you can switch between them. Preamps are also quite useful for recording, especially if you're the sort of guitar player who likes to record digitally with a computer-based system, perhaps use a cabinet simulator, and you're trying to get better guitar tones. So having a nice valve preamplifier before the cabinet simulator can liven up your sound and make it feel better under the fingers, just give you a more authentic traditional style guitar tone. One other question we sometimes get is, can I use pedals other than preamplifier pedals to drive my power amp directly? So if your amp's got an effects loop, you might say, well, could I try maybe an overdrive pedal or a boost to go straight into the power amp? And you can always try that, and results will vary. Generally speaking though, it'll sound a bit dull and lifeless, a little bit flat, because as I've described already, the preamplifier colours the sound a lot. So if you take the preamplifier out of your amplifier, then the effects pedals, which are used to going into a preamp first, are going to sound a lot darker than they would normally. Preamplifier pedals which are designed to replace a guitar amp's preamp have quite a lot of clarity and top end. So that's something to keep in mind. Alright, well, hopefully that's answered a few questions about preamps, and I'll make another video where I talk a little bit about the specific models we offer and some of their features. Thanks very much.